A homeless man, despite being exhausted by hunger, saw an elderly woman struggling to carry several shopping bags. Despite her weakness, he decided to help her and accompanied her home. The next day, the elderly woman noticed something strange in her bag and, worried, called supermarket security. The man was located and abruptly taken back to the store. However, what he revealed in front of everyone completely changed the situation, causing those present to fall to their knees, deeply remorseful, asking for his forgiveness. When Hurricane Florence hit North Carolina in 2018, many people living in the city lost everything, including Jackson Morgan. Jackson had not only lost material possessions, but also his beloved wife, Ava, and his adorable daughter, Zoe. It was a dark, rainy night, the road was wet, and Jackson had left for work at the last minute. He was a simple construction worker, and the chief contractor had called him and other employees to reinforce the beams of a building at the last minute, as the news reported the arrival of a hurricane in the city as certain. The phone line crackled with the sound of heavy rain falling outside. Jackson was at home, trying to prepare for the storm, when the phone rang. "Hello, Jackson?" The supervisor's voice echoed over the line, urgent. "Yes, it's me. What happened?" Jackson responded, feeling the weight in his boss's voice. "Listen, the weather is getting ugly. The hurricane is coming faster than we expected. I need you and your team now. We have to reinforce the building's beams before the storm gets worse. I know it's short notice, but it's the only way to keep the building from collapsing. Can you come?" Jackson hesitated for a moment, but he couldn't just deny a direct order from the head contractor, so he agreed. Jackson gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The rain fell in torrents, turning the road into a muddy river. He tried to maintain control of the car, but with every kilometer he traveled, fear grew inside him. Hurricane Florence was approaching, and he knew that even with all the urgency of the work, the situation outside was becoming increasingly dangerous. "I should be home," thought Jackson, dodging a giant puddle that almost caused the car to skid. Ava and Zoe, they need me now. But at the same time, the weight of the responsibility of his work forced him to move forward. The boss had insisted, and he couldn't just abandon the work. The building needed reinforcement, and if something went wrong, the consequences would be serious. When he finally arrived at the building, the scene was bleak. The wind was already starting to blow hard, and the rain seemed to have no end. The supervisor was there waiting with the other workers, all trying to protect what they could as the weather worsened. "Jackson, I'm glad you're here," said the boss with a tense tone. "We're going to need the whole team. We need to reinforce these beams as soon as possible." Jackson nodded. He donned his uniform and joined the others, working against time. The sound of the rain was deafening, but they were determined to finish the job. As the hours passed, the weather worsened even more. The wind began to howl and the rain fell in sheets, making work difficult. Jackson could barely see what he was doing, the water running down his face and mixing with his sweat. But he couldn't stop. He knew he had to do his part. However, when the rain increased and the wind became almost unbearable, Jackson began to doubt. The feeling of danger was intensifying, and he knew that conditions were becoming increasingly risky. "Boss, things are getting ugly. We can't continue like this. I'm going back home. The team's safety is at risk," Jackson shouted over the noise of the storm, feeling the tension taking over his body. The boss approached, visibly irritated. "Jackson, we can't stop now. The hurricane is coming, and if we don't finish this reinforcement, the work will collapse. We need you here. You're the only one who can do this right." Jackson looked at the other workers, all wet to the bone, and his protective instinct took over. He couldn't risk anyone else's life, and his family was waiting for him. "I'm not going to risk my life because of this, nor the lives of others," Jackson responded, anger and fear brimming in his voice. "I've done what I can, but now I'm going back home. I'm not staying here in this storm." The supervisor tried to insist, but the tension between them was clear. "Jackson, you can't do this. This is no time to be weak." "Weak? You think I'm being weak? I'm thinking about safety, and if you can't see that, then I don't know what else to do," Jackson shouted, now completely furious. He knew the storm was getting worse and wasn't going to wait to see what else might happen. He turned his back to his boss and, without saying anything else, grabbed his backpack and ran to the car. The wind seemed to push him back, but he kept moving forward. Each step seemed harder, but he knew he was doing the right thing. The car swayed in the wind as Jackson drove back home. He looked up at the dark, tumultuous sky and felt relief mixed with a sense of guilt. But deep down, he knew he had made the right decision, even if he had to face the consequences later. But as he approached the city, the scene became increasingly apocalyptic. Trees fell like dominoes, partially blocking the road, and road signs were easily uprooted by the wind. The sky was so dark it looked like night, and the fury of the storm seemed to intensify by the second. The hurricane was right in his direction, and he knew he didn't have much time. "I have to get there, I have to get there," Jackson muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His heart was beating wildly, and anguish consumed him. The fear for his family's safety, the guilt for leaving, everything mixed together uncontrollably. He tried to avoid a fallen tree in the middle of the street, but the car skidded. The steering felt impossible to control, and the car skidded for a few feet before spinning violently. The sound of the impact was deafening, followed by the crash of trees that crackled all around, as if the world itself was collapsing. "No, not now," Jackson screamed, trying desperately to regain control, but the force of the wind and the water pooling on the road were stronger than he could have imagined. The car slid out of control, hitting a tree that was lying on the road. The impact was brutal. The airbag inflated, but the impact on Jackson's face was so strong that he immediately lost consciousness. The car stopped, stranded against the trunk of a tree, the rain beating incessantly against the glass while the world around it seemed to fall apart. However, the real tragedy was just beginning. Minutes passed, and Jackson had passed out, his head bleeding slightly where it had hit the steering wheel. The storm showed no signs of abating. The wind howled harder, and the rain seemed heavier than ever. He was there, immobilized with his life at stake, but unconscious and unable to do anything. The cold light of the hospital seemed to cut through the silence, and the monotonous beeping sound of the monitors echoed in the room. Jackson was lying on a bed, his eyes closed, his head heavy and dazed. He felt a searing pain in his head, and the feeling of disorientation enveloped him like a fog. With each breath, a shiver ran through his body, and he struggled to remember where he was, what had happened. When he opened his eyes, his vision was blurry. The light of the hospital was cold and impersonal, but all around him the silence was profound, as if the world had stopped. He blinked several times, trying to understand, until a doctor's voice interrupted his thoughts. Jackson, are you waking up?" said the deep and calm voice. The doctor was standing next to the bed with a serious expression. Jackson tried to move, but his body was weak, almost without strength. You're okay," the doctor continued, adjusting the monitors and taking quick notes. "But you were in an accident. You lost control of the car and were found unconscious on the road." Jackson tried to sit up, but the pain in his head made him groan. He looked around, still dazed, trying to process what was happening. I need to know. How is my family?" he asked in a weak voice, a tightness in his chest already growing. With every word, he felt the weight of his question. Fear coiled in his stomach. The doctor hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting away briefly as if it was difficult to give the answer he feared. "Jackson, I'm so sorry," the doctor said finally, his tone brimming with compassion. His house was destroyed by the hurricane. When rescue services arrived, there was no one left. His wife, Ava, his daughter, Zoe, didn't survive. The words fell upon Jackson like a blow straight to the heart. He lay still for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard, but his mind couldn't catch up with reality. The sound of his heart pounding in his chest was deafening, and he couldn't breathe. His eyes filled with tears, but there was no strength for the words to come out of his mouth. He wanted to scream, wanted to ask why this had happened, but the pain inside him paralyzed him. He closed his eyes, trying to hold back the tears, but he couldn't control them anymore. The weight of the loss was unbearable. His heart, which once throbbed with the hope of returning home, was now empty, crushed by tragedy. The image of Ava and Zoe, with their smiles and laughter, seemed like a distant memory, a life he could no longer touch. "I failed," he murmured, pain in his voice. "I failed them." Jackson's pain was immeasurable, a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, a sadness that couldn't be described in words. After the tragedy, he found no reason to move on. The house, once full of life and love, was now empty, like a hole in the chest that would never close. He could no longer get out of bed. The days passed as if they were weeks, and he was lost in his own suffering. He didn't care about anything else, not even himself. The loss of Ava and Zoe was the final blow that destroyed him. When he was fired from his job, Jackson felt neither surprise nor anger, just a deep emptiness, as if everything I had done up until that moment no longer had any meaning. Without work, without his family, he no longer had any purpose. Depression swallowed him, and he let himself be carried away by it, without resistance. The money ran out quickly. Bills piled up, but he didn't have the strength to pay them. Jackson began to wander around the city, not knowing where to go, not having a place to feel safe. Little by little, he moved away from the streets he knew, heading towards darker, more remote areas, where no one knew him and no one asked him what had happened to him. He began to hide under the overpasses, where the biting wind and constant rain made no difference, because the pain inside him was already much greater than any external storm. Jackson became a beggar. He spent his days sitting on the sidewalks, looking at the ground with his head down, trying to disappear from the sight of others. Sometimes he would get up to ask for alms, but his words would come out lifeless, without hope. He no longer knew how to ask nor why. He didn't feel shame, but he also no longer felt dignity. He didn't care how people looked at him. Everything seemed distant, as if he were in another world, watching life go by from afar, without being part of it. Sometimes he tried to close his eyes and imagine that it was all a nightmare, that when he woke up, he would find Ava and Zoe waiting for him. But when he opened his eyes, the reality was even more cruel. The world around him no longer had color. He was lost, completely lost, in an endless abyss. Jackson no longer had hope. He no longer knew what it was like to feel happiness, nor what it was to dream about the future. His only wish was for the pain to stop, for the anguish to go away. But he knew that would never happen. He was there, under an overpass, in a forgotten corner of the city, living on the edge of everything, not knowing what else to do with the life he had left. It was a cold, grey morning when Jackson approached the supermarket, wandering aimlessly through the streets. He still wore his old, dirty clothes, his face marked by pain and lost time. There was nothing that made him feel alive, but something that morning felt different. Maybe it was the tired look of an elderly woman who, with difficulty, tried to push her shopping cart to the car. She was there, in front of the supermarket, looking as fragile as the approaching winter itself. Jackson watched her for a moment, as if something connected her to him. Maybe it was the fact that, like him, she was also carrying the weight of something, an invisible burden that made her seem even lonelier. Without thinking, Jackson approached her, feeling a strange impulse, a desire to help, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He crouched down beside her and in a hoarse but gentle voice said, "Can I help you with that, ma'am? It looks like it's a little difficult to carry those bags." The woman looked at him, her eyes tired but still shining with a rare softness. She hesitated for a moment as if trying to gauge whether she could trust this dirty, homeless man. But something in his gaze, something in the way he approached, made her nod. "Well, it can't hurt to try," she said, her voice low and a little shaky. "I think these bags are heavier than I imagined." Jackson stood up and, without hesitation, grabbed the bags from the cart. He noticed how fragile she was, her body bowed by the weight of years and life. The pain in his chest increased, but he couldn't help but feel touched by this woman. He knew what it was like to feel alone, lost in the world, but she seemed to be a reflection of what he could have been if he hadn't lost everything. "Let me carry this for you to the car," Jackson said, trying to smile, but his smile was weak, like it was something he'd forgotten how to do. I understand how difficult it is to carry things when you're tired." The woman looked at him, her eyes now more attentive. "You're a good guy, you know that? I never imagined someone like you, someone so different, would offer to help me." Jackson felt a lump in his throat. She was talking about him as if he were a good person, someone who still had some good left in him, someone who deserved a little kindness, but he knew the truth was different. He didn't deserve any of this. He was no longer the man she thought he was. I'm not as good as you think," Jackson said, voice shaking. I'm just trying to do something right, even if for a moment." The woman smiled softly, as if she knew exactly what he meant. "We all make mistakes, young man, but in the end it's what we do for others that counts. Kindness still has value in the world." They walked to the car together, and Jackson placed the bags on the car seat. The woman seemed relieved, but also a little grateful, as if that small gesture had made a difference in her day. She looked at him, her eyes filled with silent wisdom. "Thank you, my son," she said, her voice soft. "I know life can be hard, but never lose your kindness. It's what keeps us human." Jackson watched her as she got into her car and drove it slowly down the street. He stood there, watching the car drive away, his heart sinking, but also touched by those words. Kindness still had value. Maybe he still had something good inside him, something he had lost that could be found again. Marlene arrived home, the tiredness of the day weighing on her fragile shoulders. She slowly parked the car in the garage and with difficulty got out of the vehicle, leaning on the door as she tried to maintain her balance. His house was silent, which was a comfort, but also a constant reminder of his loneliness. With slow steps, she walked to the kitchen where she placed the shopping bags on the table. She took out the items, organizing them with the calm that only life experience could provide. But then, as he was going through the bags, something caught his attention, something that shouldn't be there. She noticed a small, simple gold chain that had fallen out among her purchases. Marlene frowned, taking the chain between her fingers. It wasn't hers. She was sure of it. The chain was clean and well-maintained, nothing like the one she wore, which had aged with time. She turned the chain in her hand, feeling the weight of it, and a feeling of discomfort began to grow inside her. How could a strange current have appeared there? She remembered the man who had helped her at the supermarket, Jackson. He looked so lost, like he was struggling with some invisible pain. But there was no way the chain was his. He seemed to be without any possessions, without anything other than his torn clothes. With a heavy sigh, Marlene sat down on the kitchen chair, staring at the chain. Something about her seemed special. It was simple, but it carried something that touched her deeply, as if she had been left there as a symbol, a silent connection between her and that lost man. She knew what she needed to do. That man, with his unexpected kindness, deserved more than a simple thank you. She needed to return the chain. It was the least I could do for him, for everything he seemed to carry in his heart. Without hesitation, Marlene picked up the phone and called the supermarket. His voice, soft and gentle, was answered almost immediately. "Hello, good morning. I was wondering if you could help me find a man who helped me today in front of the supermarket," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of urgency. "He had dirty clothes and seemed a little disoriented. I think he left a chain in my bag. It wasn't mine, and I'd like to give it back." The attendant on the other end was silent for a moment, probably surprised by the request. "Ma'am, I'll check for you. Just a moment." Marlene closed her eyes, tightening her grip on the chain with shaking hands. She knew that little piece of metal wouldn't change Jackson's life, but maybe by giving it back, she could give back something more valuable. "Ma'am?" The attendant's voice interrupted her thoughts. "We found the man's record. His name is Jackson. He was helping you today, right? I'll pass your information on to the manager, and he'll contact you so we can find him." Marlene thanked her, feeling a slight sense of relief. As she hung up the phone, Marlene looked at the chain once again. The simple piece seemed to carry immense weight. She held it against her chest, closing her eyes, silently wishing that Jackson's life could have some light again. "You will find a way, young man," she whispered, as if her words could reach across the distance and reach Jackson, wherever he was. "I'll help you." The next day, Marlene woke up early, went to the supermarket and started looking. It didn't take long for her to see him. Jackson was there, near the shelves, with a distant and blank expression. He looked even more dejected than the day before, as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. But when he saw her, his eyes lit up for a brief moment, as if he was surprised, or maybe even hopeful. Marlene approached him with soft steps, and when she got close, she reached out, holding the chain he had left in his bag. Her fingers were shaking, but she tried to hide it, looking directly at him with silent kindness. "Jackson," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion, "I found this with my shopping yesterday. I think you dropped it." Jackson looked at the chain, and his face instantly changed. His eyes filled with tears, and he lowered his head, as if the weight of that simple piece of metal was unbearable. He reached out, shaking, and grabbed the chain, clutching it to his chest. That's from my wife," he said, his voice breaking. "It was hers, Ava. Ava wore that chain every day. It was a gift I gave her on our anniversary. She said the chain was a symbol of our love. And now I don't have anything left of her. Just this current." Jackson's words came out as a whisper, but the pain in his voice was palpable. He was trying hard to maintain his composure, but tears began to stream down his face without him being able to control them. Marlene felt her heart sink when she saw him there, before her, so broken, so lost. I didn't know," Marlene said, her voice cracking with emotion. I didn't know it meant so much to you. I just wanted to return something I found. I didn't realize it was so important." Jackson looked at her, and for a moment their eyes met, as if he was trying to absorb everything she was saying. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his feelings, but the words just wouldn't come out. Instead, he sat in one of the nearby chairs, his shoulders hunched, and the pain seemed to consume him again. "I lost everything, you know," Jackson began, his voice now calmer but still filled with sadness. "I lost my wife, my daughter, everything I loved." I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I should have stayed home, but I was so worried about work, about the things I thought that were important. And when the hurricane arrived, there was nothing left. There was no one left. Only emptiness. And now I only have this chain." Marlene sat next to him, feeling the pain he was sharing, as if she could touch every word, every piece of his loss. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to ease Jackson's pain, but she knew that at that moment he needed to be heard. "I know nothing I say will bring your wife and daughter back," Marlene said, her voice soft but full of empathy. "But you're not alone, Jackson. I know it feels like it, but it's not. Sometimes what we need most is someone to listen, to understand the pain we're carrying, and I'm here. If you need someone, even if just to talk, I'll be here." Jackson looked at her, and for a moment he looked surprised, as if it was the first time in a long time that someone had actually cared. He swallowed hard, tears still flowing, but he no longer cared about hiding what he felt. He was tired of hiding from the pain. I don't know what to do," he said, his voice filled with a vulnerability he had never shown before. "I don't know how to go on, how to move on after losing everything." Marlene placed her hand gently on his shoulder, a simple gesture but full of meaning. "You will find a way, Jackson, even when it seems impossible. Life doesn't end with pain, it just changes. And you, in time, will discover that there is still something good waiting for you, even if you don't see it now." Marlene looked at Jackson, still with the chain in his hands, his eyes teary and his heart tight with the pain he carried. She knew words of comfort were important, but more than that, he needed a chance. He needed a way to start over, to find a purpose, something that would lift him out of the abyss of sadness and hopelessness in which he was immersed. She sighed deeply and, with a firm decision, said, "Jackson, I see the pain you're carrying, and I know I can't erase what happened, but I want to help you start over. I have a company, a consultancy that takes care of small and medium-sized businesses. I know the path it will be difficult, but you have a chance to change your life, and I want to offer you that chance." Jackson looked at her astonished. "I didn't know what to say. I didn't believe what I was hearing. How could someone like him, someone who had lost everything, be offered a chance to rebuild his life? Would you give me a job?" he asked, voice cracking, not knowing how to process Marlene's generosity. Marlene smiled softly, a smile that carried the wisdom of years but also an unwavering strength. "Yes, Jackson, I see something in you. I see that, despite all the pain, you still have something inside you that's worth it. I'm not offering you this as charity. I'm offering you an opportunity. It has potential, even if I don't see it now." Jackson was silent for a moment, trying to understand what she was saying. He felt a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had gotten used to the idea that he was lost, aimless. But there in front of Marlene he felt a spark of hope lighting up inside him, something he thought he had lost forever. "But that's not all," Marlene continued, with an expression of determination. "I'm going to make sure your rent is paid for at least 6 months. I know you can't afford it right now, and I don't want you to worry about the financial part while you stabilize. Plus, I'm going to talk to my lawyers to ensure you receive compensation from the state for its negligence in handling the aftermath of the hurricane. You are not to blame for losing everything, and the state needs to recognize that." Jackson was in shock. The job offer, the support with rent, the promise of compensation, everything seemed like a dream. He couldn't believe that after everything he had been through, someone like Marlene was still willing to reach out to him. I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "This is more than I ever imagined. I don't even know where to start." Marlene looked at him with a look full of understanding. "You don't need to thank me, Jackson. I know that life is hard, and that what you went through is something no human being should ever have to live through. But life isn't about what we lose. It's about what we do with it, what we still have. I believe you have something inside you that will shine if you let it. I'm just here to give you a push." Over the next few months, Jackson began to adapt to the new life Marlene provided him. He threw himself into his work with renewed passion, learning new skills and rebuilding his confidence. Every day he felt more grateful for the chance he had been given. Marlene became not only a mentor, but a true friend. She helped him deal with challenges, always with words of support and guidance. Over time, Jackson was able to pay off his debts and begin planning for a future he never imagined possible. He rented a small apartment and began to feel at home again. The compensation he received from the state helped cover initial costs and gave him financial relief he never imagined. He used this money wisely, investing in his future and ensuring that he could finally look to tomorrow with hope. The story of Jackson and Marlene teaches us that a simple attitude, like reaching out to help someone, can transform not only another person's life, but also ours. Sometimes a gesture of generosity, without expecting anything in return, can be the key to lifting someone up who is lost in pain and hopelessness. By treating others with respect and compassion, without judging their circumstances, we can be the light they so desperately need to find a new path. Generosity is often not limited to big actions, but to small daily gestures that, in the end, have the power to change everything. Life is about connections, and every act of kindness can reverberate in unimaginable ways, transforming lives and creating a lasting impact. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Here, you will find exciting stories every day, made to touch your heart. And I'm sure that the story that's appearing on the screen now will move you too. Don't miss it.